And tonight we are in for a treat, and I'm going to introduce now Dr. Alex McFarland. He is the president of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's the host of Sound Reason, which is a daily live national talk radio program, airs on nearly 200 stations around the country. He's an author and speaker that travels extensively, and he's going to be our moderator tonight. Would you welcome Dr. Alex McFarland?
Thank you, Pastor Mark Cowart, and thank all of you for being here tonight on a night that, at least here in Colorado, has had intermittent snow. So weather notwithstanding, we welcome you all. It is a great joy to be here. We are in for a treat, and I believe that we'll all leave here intellectually enriched. Before I introduce our two presenters, I do want to say how much we appreciate the staff of Church for All Nations. I represent Southern Evangelical Seminary, and for a number of months, our school has been working with Church for All Nations to prepare for this night. And I have to say, after having done a number of events like this around the country, that we've never worked with a greater group, a more hardworking staff, a visionary pastor and leader with whom it's just a joy to work. And so could we just affirm and appreciate Mark Cowart and Church for All Nations. Thank you very much. It's going to be an exciting night. Each of our presenters will give content. There'll be opening statements, rebuttals, cross-examinations. There will be an opportunity for you, the audience, to text or tweet in your questions. And I'm going to give that information, that instruction, after a brief intermission, about 3/4 of the way through the evening. We'll come back and we will take your questions. And so listen carefully, and I will give this again. But to text a question for Dr. Howe, you can text Howe, Howe, and your question to 22333, 22333. To text a question for Dr. Shermer, you type in Shermer, Shermer, and your question to 22333. To tweet a question for Dr. Richard Howe, see, all of this new technology has just given us so many options. For Dr. Richard Howe, you tweet Howe, Howe, and your question to @Poll, Poll. To tweet a question for Dr. Michael Shermer, you tweet the word Shermer, Shermer, and your question to the symbol for @Poll, Poll. To Skype a question for either. So we have options. What you have, we can accommodate. You can Skype a question to debate.support. And we just want to, again, welcome all of the audiences, Littleton, Colorado, Liberal, Kansas, people in the Southwest campus. We have a group watching in England, so hello to the UK. A group in Slovenia. And how we welcome them. And we have a group back in Charlotte, North Carolina at our school where we had the joy 2 years ago of having Dr. Shermer debate with Dinesh D'Souza back at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And I've got to say, while we're handing out the kudos, thanks to Blake Anderson, Eric Gustafson, and so many people back there, Duke Hale and the others. Hi, SES. We're glad you're watching too. And so at this point, it's time to get to the business at hand. You know, Louis Pasteur said that deep in the soul of every person, there's the belief that there must be something more than just a mere combination of events. Studies show that some 94 to 96% of American citizens believe that some type of higher being, God, exists. And so we're here tonight to hear about the question, does God exist? And we're very fortunate to have two very gifted presenters, each to speak to this issue. I'll give you their bios now, and then I want you to help me welcome them when they come. Dr. Richard G. Howe is the professor of philosophy and apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary. He directs the PhD program there. He has a BA in Bible from Mississippi College, an MA in philosophy from the University of Mississippi, and he earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. He's been a contributor to a number of books, including the popular Encyclopedia of Apologetics, Reasons for Faith, To Everyone an Answer, and is a contributing writer for the Christian Research Journal. He has spoken in the U.S., in Canada, in Africa, Europe, Italy, and on in other venues on issues relating to the Christian faith. In their free time, Richard and his wife Rebecca enjoy international travel. Dr. Michael Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic magazine. The website is skeptic.com. He's the executive director of the Skeptic Society, a monthly columnist for Scientific American, and the host of the Skeptics Distinguished Science Lecture Series at Caltech, an adjunct professor of economics at Claremont Graduate University. Earned his BA in psychology from Pepperdine, an MA in experimental psychology from California State, and a PhD in the history of science from the Claremont Graduate School. He was a college professor for 20 years. He taught psychology, evolution, and the history of science at Occidental College, California State University at LA, and at Glendale College. He has been seen on the Colbert Report 2020, Dateline, Larry King, PBS, the Discovery Channel, the Science Channel. But millions may have seen Dr. Michael Shermer for the first time in the movie Expelled, in which he was prominently featured. He's written a number of books, In Darwin's Shadow, about the life and science of the co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace. He wrote Denying History on Holocaust denial and other forms of pseudo-history. His book, How We Believe Science, Skepticism, and the Search for God, presents Dr. Shermer's theory on the origins of religion and why people believe in God. Folks, for their months of preparation, for their time with us here tonight, would you please help me welcome Dr. Michael Shermer and Dr. Richard Howe. The debate will be as follows. There will be an opening statement from each of the presenters. There will be a response, a rebuttal, a second response, and a rebuttal, then the intermission, then your questions, and then from each of the presenters, a closing statement. Here to give the opening statement in the affirmative, Dr. Richard Howe.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence. The philosopher Immanuel Kant remarked, quote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Taking my cue from these words, I wish to defend the notion that the existence of God is a reasonable inference from the evidence regarding a number of features about reality. By God, I mean a being who is the personal, timeless, immaterial cause of the existence and design of the universe and the ground of moral reality. I believe that the existence of God is a reasonable inference from the evidence of these four features of reality: the coming into existence of the universe, the current existing of the universe, design in the universe, and moral reality. First, the coming into existence of the universe. In philosophy, this is a version of the cosmological argument known as the Kalam cosmological argument. It seeks to demonstrate that the universe came into existence a finite time ago, that is, it must have had a beginning, and thus needs a cause to explain its existence. The medieval jurist, theologian, philosopher, and mystic Al-Ghazali succinctly formulated this argument and has been popularized by the contemporary Christian philosopher and theologian William Lane Craig this way: the universe began to exist. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. In defense of the first premise, I think both scientific and philosophical evidence point to the fact that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. The scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe includes the expanding universe, the second law of thermodynamics, and the Big Bang Theory. The philosophical evidence for the beginning of the universe has to do with the impossibility of the past being infinite because of the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite length of time. For the sake of time, I will unpack only the scientific evidence and leave the details of the philosophical argument either to any rebuttal time, if Michael brings the subject up, or to the Q&A time if anyone is interested in exploring it. First, the evidence of the expanding universe. Scientists maintain that every object in the universe is moving away from every other object, such that even space itself is expanding. Physicist George Gamow says, quote, "The entire space of the universe, populated by billions of galaxies, is in a rapid state of expansion, with all of its members flying away from one another at high speed," unquote. As Albert Einstein observed, quote, "Hubble's discovery can therefore be considered to some extent as a confirmation of the theory of the expansion of space," unquote. Noted physicist Stephen Hawking explains, quote, "The old idea of an essentially unchanging universe that could have existed or could continue to exist forever was replaced by the notion of a dynamic, expanding universe that seemed to have begun a finite time ago and that might end at a finite time in the future," unquote. The universe could not have been expanding from eternity, otherwise it would be infinitely dispersed, which it is not. Therefore, the universe began to exist a finite time ago. Second, the second law of thermodynamics says that all closed systems will tend toward a state of maximum disorder or entropy. In a closed system, the amount of energy available to do work decreases and becomes uniform. This amounts to saying that the universe is running down. Physicist Rudolf Clausius, who can be considered in many ways to be the formulator of the second law of thermodynamics, stated it this way, quote, "We can express the fundamental laws of the universe which correspond to the fundamental laws of the mechanical theory of heat in the following simple form. The energy of the universe is constant. The entropy of the universe tends towards a maximum," unquote. Astronomer and agnostic Robert Jastrow observed, quote, "The laws of thermodynamics point to one conclusion, that the universe had a beginning," unquote. The universe could not have been running down from eternity, otherwise it would have run down by now, which it has not. Therefore, the universe began to exist a finite time ago. Third, the Big Bang Theory is the idea that the universe began in a colossal explosion a finite time ago. Physicist Steven Weinberg comments, quote, "In the beginning there was an explosion, not an explosion like those familiar on Earth, an explosion which occurred simultaneously everywhere, filling all space from the beginning with every particle of matter rushing apart from every other particle," unquote. Theoretical physicist Paul Davies comments, quote, "These days most cosmologists and astronomers back the theory that there was indeed a creation, when the physical universe burst into existence in an awesome explosion popularly known as the Big Bang. Whether one accepts all the details or not, the essential hypothesis that there was some sort of creation seems, from the scientific point of view, compelling," unquote. Physicist Stephen Hawking observes, quote, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang," unquote. Physicist Alexander Vilenkin summarized the state of the issue this way, quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning," unquote. Physicist Victor Weisskopf muses, quote, "The question of the origin of the universe is one of the most exciting topics for a scientist to deal with. The origin of the universe can be talked about not only in scientific terms, but also in poetic and spiritual language, an approach that is complementary to the scientific one. Indeed, the Judeo-Christian tradition describes the beginning of the world in a way that is surprisingly similar to the scientific model," unquote. Astrophysicist Christopher Isham has, I believe, accurately observed, quote, "Perhaps the best argument in favor of the thesis that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it is greeted by some atheist physicists. At times, this has led to scientific ideas such as continuous creation or an oscillating universe being advanced with a tenacity which so exceeds their intrinsic worth that one can only suspect the operation of psychological forces lying very much deeper than the usual academic desire for a theorist to support his or her theory," unquote. The universe has not existed from eternity, according to the Big Bang Theory. Therefore, the universe began a finite time ago. If my inference from the expanding universe, the second law of thermodynamics, and the Big Bang Theory is correct, then the universe began to exist a finite time ago. The second premise of the syllogism says, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Notice that the argument is not saying everything must have a cause of its existence. The theist position is that everything that begins to exist, that is, every finite contingent being, must have a cause of its existence. Everything we now know about the universe suggests that the things that make up the universe are caused to exist. Thus, there must be something that caused the universe to exist, which is itself not part of the universe. The conclusion of the syllogism follows necessarily. The universe has a cause of its existence. But since this is the beginning of the physical temporal universe itself, then the cause cannot itself be physical or temporal. As atheist philosopher Quentin Smith observes, quote, "It belongs analytically to the concept of the cosmological singularity that it is not the effect of prior physical events. This effectively rules out the idea that the singularity is an effect of some prior natural process," unquote. Further, it seems the best way to account for why the universe could have come into existence only a finite time ago, if the cause of the universe is itself timeless and eternal, is that the cause must not itself be an impersonal mechanical cause, but rather a personal cause that willed the universe to come into existence. This is so because if the cause of the universe was merely a sufficient condition for the universe, then the effect of the cause would have existed along with the cause. But we have seen that the scientific evidence points to a beginning of the universe. Thus, we have a universe caused by something that is not itself the universe, namely something that is non-physical, timeless, supernatural, and personal. I submit that this cause is God. Second, the current existing of the universe. This is another version of the cosmological argument. Even if the universe has always existed, one would still need to posit a cause of its current existing. This is an argument based on the thinking of the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas. When we observe things, we notice that there is a distinction between a thing's essence and a thing's existence. Essence is what something is. Existence is whether it is. Take yourself as a human being, for example. What this means is that your essence as a human is distinct from your existence as a being. Your essence is what makes you human. Your existence is what makes you a being. Your essence is what you are. Your existence is whether you are. With this distinction in mind, the argument is this: whatever is true of you must either be because of your essence or not. For example, the fact that you have risibility, the ability to laugh, is because of your essence. You have risibility by virtue of being a human. Other things are not because of your essence. For example, the fact that you're in Colorado tonight. It is not by virtue of being human that you are in Colorado. Otherwise, no one outside Colorado would be human. However, you can explain how it is that you are in Colorado despite the fact that it's accidental to you as a human. You are in Colorado because you caused yourself to be in Colorado. Now consider your own existing. Clearly, you do not exist by virtue of being a human. Existence is not part of your essence. But just as clearly, you cannot be the cause of your own existing. Otherwise, you would have to exist before you exist, which is a contradiction. Therefore, your existing must be caused by something else. But then that thing's existing must either be because of its essence or caused by something else. Now, this series of causes cannot go on to infinity. An illustration might help to show why. If you saw a train of boxcars moving by, you might see the need to explain the movement of the boxcars. However, it would not do to say the reason this boxcar is moving is because the boxcar in front of it is pulling it. For then the question would suggest itself, well, why is that boxcar moving? Further, it would not do to say that there are an infinite number of boxcars. Why not? Because even an infinite number of boxcars is not sufficient to explain why the whole train of boxcars is moving. Only an engine can account for the motion of the train. But if there is an infinite number of boxcars, there would not be an engine at the start of the train, and thus there would be no motion from the engine, nor any motion throughout the train. Likewise, when it comes to explaining the existence of things whose essences do not account for their existing, it must be because there is something that exists whose essence is its existence. And as the Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas sententiously observed, all men know this to be God. Third, the design in the universe. In philosophy, this is known as the design or teleological argument. The notion of design can be unpacked along several lines, two of which I want to examine. Design as fine-tuning an origin of life, and design as information. First, design is fine-tuning the origin of life. According to philosopher Robin Collins, quote, when scientists talk about the fine-tuning of the universe, they're generally referring to an extraordinary balancing of fundamental laws and parameters of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. Our minds can't comprehend the precision of some of them. The result is a universe that has just the right conditions to sustain life. The coincidences are simply too amazing to have been the result of happenstance, unquote. Astronomer Hugh Ross lists over 35 physical constants or values that are necessary for life. He argues that their simultaneous instantiation seems so antecedently improbable that the appeal to a cosmic mind and fashioner to explain them is more reasonable than attributing their coalescing to mere chance. Such values include the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the gravitational constant, the electromagnetic force constant, and others. In addition, Ross estimates that the probability of the 122 parameters for a life-supporting planet is about 10 to the negative 160th power. Even with a generous estimate of about 10 to the 22nd power number of planets in the universe, this leaves the probability of there being one such supporting planet at about 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power. To give you a better appreciation of just how large this number is, realize that the estimation of the number of atoms in the known universe is about 10 to the 79th power. Clearly, 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power is unimaginable. Physicist and Anglican priest John Polkinghorne argues, quote, there seems to be a chance of a revised and revived argument from design, appealing to a cosmic planner who has endowed the world with a potentiality implanted within the delicate balance of the laws of nature themselves, which laws science cannot explain because it assumes them as the basis for its explanation of the process. In short, the claim would be that the universe is indeed the carefully calculated construct of its creator, unquote. Astronomer Robert Jastrow concurs, quote, according to the physicist and the astronomer, it appears that the universe was constructed within very narrow limits in such a way that man could dwell in it. This result is called the anthropic principle. It is the most theistic result ever to come out of science, in my view. These amazing initial conditions of the universe are what made it possible for there to be biological life. In response to this, however, some have nevertheless suggested that the theory of evolution is adequate to account for this apparent design. But is it reasonable to relegate this fine-tuning or the origin of life to evolutionary theory? It is manifest that evolution cannot itself be responsible for the initial fine-tuning conditions of the universe, since the process of evolution presupposes these very conditions. And as an explanation of the origins of life itself, it fares no better. Biochemist Charles Thaxton, mechanical engineer Walter Bradley, and geochemist Roger L. Olson, in their book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, deftly demonstrate the possibility of the origin of life by chance, where the idea of chance here factors in the known laws of physics and chemistry. They explain, quote, without a doubt, the atoms and molecules which comprise living cells individually obey the laws of chemistry and physics. The enigma is the origin of so unlikely an organization of these atoms and molecules. It is apparent that chance should be abandoned as an acceptable model for coding of these macromolecules essential in living systems, unquote. Thus, it seems clear that the reasonable inference from the evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe and the origin of life is the deliberate causal activity of God. Second, design is information. It is evident that our world exhibits order and complexity. Scientists believe that the known laws of nature can account for the occurrence of certain manifestations of order and complexity. But there's a certain type of order or complexity that known laws and regularities cannot account for. This is information. Scaling a mountain, you observe much complexity but no order in the seemingly random arrangements of rocks, mounds, and rivulets. All of this complexity can be explained by the natural effect of gravity and wind and water erosion. At the top of the mountain, you examine a snowflake. A snowflake contains much order but little complexity. You can account for the crystal formation of the snowflake by the behavior of water as it freezes because of the nature of the water molecule. But you can go to a mountain and see the carvings of Mount Rushmore. The peculiar arrangement of features exhibits a specified complexity or information. The significance of finding information is that uniform experience indicates that information comes from intelligence. You would never be obliged to try to explain the information in Mount Rushmore on the basis of gravity or wind and water erosion. Some scientists insist that there is information in nature. This information is contained in the DNA molecule. According to Thaxton and Bradley, quote, proponents of an intelligent origin of life note that molecular biology has uncovered an analogy between DNA and language. The genetic code functions exactly like a language code. Indeed, it is a code. It is a molecular communication system. A sequence of chemical letters stores and transmits communication in each living cell, unquote. Philosopher of science Stephen Meyer observes, quote, at nearly the same time that computer scientists were beginning to develop machine language, molecular biologists were discovering that living cells had been using something akin to machine code or software all along, unquote. Atheist biologist Richard Dawkins notes, quote, there's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over, unquote. The application of this data to the design argument is this. Uniform experience tells us that information has its origin in intelligence. Thus, it is reasonable to believe that the information in the DNA came from an intelligence, and I submit that God is the intelligent designer of biological life. Last, moral reality. In philosophy, this is known as the moral argument. The existence of God is a reasonable inference from the fact that objective morality exists. On the atheist or agnostic materialist worldview, how is one to account for moral properties? How can physical objects that possess properties such as mass, inertia, charge, and spin give rise to moral properties such as justice, goodness, honesty, and love? I submit to you that they cannot, and certain atheists have admitted as much. The late atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie, in his book The Miracle of Theism, admits that, quote, objectively intrinsically prescriptive features, that is, moral properties, supervening upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them, unquote. Some atheists and agnostics misunderstand the theist argument here. Michael Shermer summarizes the argument thus. The moral argument says, quote, humans are moral beings and animals are not. Where did they get this moral drive? Through the ultimate moral being, God, unquote. Notice here that Shermer is taking the moral argument to be concerned with the origin of humans' drive for morality. He goes on later to conclude, quote, apparently you can be good without God, unquote. Apparently you can, if you take him to mean that one can be or act good without believing in the existence of God. Ignoring the fact that in the middle of his analysis of the moral argument, he moves from framing the issue of how one might act if there was no God to how one might act if one believed there was no God, which is no small difference. He nevertheless misses the point of the argument. The argument is not claiming that atheists or agnostics cannot be good or act moral. I'm sure that many atheists and agnostics lead exemplary lives, and I have no reason to doubt that Michael Shermer is one of them. Rather, the issue is whether the atheist or agnostic can be justified in being moral. The concern here is the metaphysical grounding of what we all know to be the case, namely that there are certain actions that are objectively right and others that are objectively wrong. An illustration may help to show the distinction I'm making here. Since theists believe that God created the universe, theists believe that gravity exists because of God. Atheists deny and agnostics doubt that God created gravity. But just because atheists and agnostics deny or doubt the actual cause of gravity does not mean that atheists and agnostics float. Just as atheists and agnostics... Okay, thank you.
We go to the scripting segment in denial of Michael Shermer.
Okay, how's that? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? So you don't use AT&T here, I see. Yeah. It seems to be a universal problem. Anyway, so I thought I'd start with some slides here, just give an opening statement about what I do and why I'm here, and you want to fire up the PowerPoint there. And I just basically have 2 points about this, and then in the 2 rebuttal sessions, I'll address each of the points of Dr. Howe specifically. So I'll just do the next slide, and we'll just rifle through them. Well, okay, slow down. So basically, that was my magazine that went whirring by there, Skeptic Magazine. It's the quarterly publication of the Skeptic. You can go back one more. There you go. Quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society. We investigate claims to paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups, and cultic claims of all kinds between junk science, good science, bad science, voodoo science, Pathological Science, Non-Science, and Plain Old Nonsense. So, and it's available at every bookstore in North America. You can go to skeptic.com and get your subscription. Operators are standing by. That's the commercial portion of the evening. Anyway, we deal with a lot of different things. Was 9/11 a conspiracy theory? Global warming? The Mythbusters blowing stuff up in the name of science? The future of intelligence? The God question comes up probably more than just about anything else because, well, it's important and people are interested in it. So you can go 2 slides forward. Basically what we do at Skeptic is that we promote science, and that is science is we want to look for natural explanations for all phenomena. That's a crop circle that says skeptic.com. What an amazing coincidence that the aliens happen to know our webpage. But what are the chances of that really, or that somebody photoshopped that, right? So again, let's look for natural explanations before we turn to supernatural explanations. Next slide. Or before we say something is out of this world, let's first make sure that it's not in this world. Again, what's more likely? That aliens traversed vast distances of interstellar space and landed in Sacramento, California to help the governor of my great state run the state into bankruptcy? Or that the World Weekly News just makes stuff up, right? Again, next slide. So this is my favorite cartoon along these lines. The Sidney Harris cartoon, for those of you in the back, it says, then a miracle occurs in the middle of that chalkboard. He says, I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. Essentially, this is what all of the arguments you've just heard are lumped as. Next slide. That is, these are what we call the God of the gaps argument. Wherever there's a gap that you guys, you scientists, can't explain, that means there must be a God to fill that gap. So, for example, every argument you just heard goes along these lines. X looks created. I can't think of how X was created naturally. Therefore, X was created supernaturally. It doesn't matter what the X is, DNA, the moral law, the starry heavens above, the moral law within, the fine-tuning, whatever, the second law of thermodynamics. These are all just X's to be filled by some explanation. And if you scientist guys don't have an explanation, then that's our argument for God. Of course, what are you going to do with your faith if the scientists explain that X? Because that's what we do for a living. We fill gaps, right? And the gaps have been filled consistently for 400 years. The number of X's available to make that argument are growing smaller. Next slide. For example, in Newton's own time, he wrote about the problem of the plane. That is why all the planets are in the plane of the ecliptic, all going around the sun in the same direction, and all in this flat disk, except for Pluto, but it's no longer a planet, so that's not a problem. Voted out by committee. Anyway, so Newton writes, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Why do theologians and intelligent design theorists never quote Newton? And the answer is because that X, that gap has been filled. We now know how solar systems are formed. We know why planets all go in the same direction around the sun and why they're in a flat disk, having to do with the condensation of interstellar gas into a cloud, which then begins, as it begins to collapse, it begins to spin. As it spins, it flattens into a disk. Little asymmetries form gravitational centers. Those become planets around the sun. Okay? So you don't need to fill the gap and say, well, I think God did it. We don't need to make that argument anymore because we have a natural explanation for it, and that is the fate of all of these gaps. Next slide. In any case, by invoking that, we can also ask, well, then who created God? That is, a being capable of designing particles, atoms, molecules, DNA, protein chains, cells, organisms, planets, stars, cannot be simple. Such a being would have to be as complex or more complex than her creations. Thank you. I am from California, after all, the home of the PC movement. Anyway, thus, by all theistic arguments for God's existence, there must be a God's God who created our God, and therefore there must necessarily be a God's God who created God ad infinitum. That is, Dr. Howe will say something like, well, no, there has to be a first cause. Well, but why stop the chain there? Why does there have to be a first cause? Why can't there be a prior cause to his first cause? And of course, there can be. Next slide. So in fact, I have invoked this, what I call Shermer's last law, because I don't believe in naming laws after yourself, so the first shall be last and the last shall be first. You may have heard that expression before. That is, any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. Okay, stay with me on this argument for a moment, and you'll see where I'm going. Next slide. I got this idea from Arthur C. Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. For example, next slide. This takes something like telepathy or mind reading. This is considered a supernatural or paranormal phenomenon. But is it? Well, first of all, I don't think it even exists, but let's say it did. Next slide. Let me introduce you to this quadriplegic who can run his computer with his thoughts alone. How does he do this? He has a computer chip in his cortex implanted there, in which he's trained just by thinking certain thoughts. It causes the neurons to fire and send signals, which are electrical, which are picked up by these chips, sent wireless to the computer, which then moves the cursor, and he can do email and play video games and so on. If you didn't know the chip was there, that would look like telepathy, like he's moving the computer through some mysterious force from his brain into the computer. But if you know the chip is there, the magic is gone, and that's just technology. Next slide. So if we do encounter an extraterrestrial intelligence of some sort, they're not going to be anything like us. First of all, they're not going to be bipedal primates with gnarly stuff on their forehead speaking English with an Indian accent like you see on Star Trek, right? This is the restrictions of wardrobe budgets and the limitations of the creative abilities of the writers. More likely, they're going to be super far advanced than us because evolution is glacially slow versus, next slide, technology is super fast. So just in the last 10,000 years, we've gotten writing, the printing press, the Industrial Revolution, just 66 years from the Wright brothers to landing on the moon, just 10 years, the World Wide Web exploded on the scene. Next slide. This is an exponential growth curve of the doubling power of all technologies and science. So imagine an extraterrestrial intelligence we might encounter. Next slide. How far advanced will they be? In just 50 years, we're already capable of manipulating genomes, of genetic engineering. We're this close. J. Craig Ventnor, one of the co-founders of the Human Genome Project, is this close to creating an entire genome in a lab, creating a life form in his lab. This will happen. If it's not in 5 years, it'll be in 50 years or 500 years. Again, any extraterrestrial intelligence we'd encounter will be 50,000 years, 500,000 years, millions of years in advance of us. And we're already able to do this in just 50 years. Next slide. It's even possible, it's been speculated by some of the people that Dr. Howe quoted in his slide, by scientists, that extraterrestrial intelligence may be able to engineer entire solar systems. All you got to do is get that interstellar cloud of gas to begin to condense. There's different technological ways you can do that. And cause the formation of solar systems, planets. Next slide. It's even possible that ETs would be able to create baby universes. One theory for the origin of our universe is a collapsing black hole in another universe. I'll come back to this in the second portion of the evening. That is, if you could cause a star to collapse, a star about 10 times the size of our star, it will form a black hole, at the center of which is a singularity, which, as some theorists think, including Stephen Hawking, that at the point of that singularity, there may bubble off another universe. Next slide. So what would you call an entity capable of creating life, planets, stars, and universes? Well, if you don't know the technology, you just fill the gap with God. If you do know the technology, you call it an extraterrestrial intelligence. Okay, here's the point of this little thought experiment. Whatever God you think you're going to find by following this chain of reasoning using science and logic and reason, you can't get to the God that you likely believe in, the God Dr. Howe defined. You can't get there. The most you can possibly get is a super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence capable of doing all the things of those gaps that we can't explain, but it's just a technological engineering problem that they will be able to solve, given how far we've been able to come already just on our own. So, now if you say, well, okay, that's not the God I'm thinking of. I'm not thinking of just a really smart engineer in a lab somewhere manipulating genomes and creating life forms and possibly even engineering solar systems, planets, and even universes. No, my God is much bigger than that. Okay, how do we know that God exists. Because by the means of science, we have to have some testable hypothesis, some way to measure it. If it's not measurable, it's not science. And I'm arguing that the best you can get with measurable means is an ETI and nothing more. Okay, maybe God is outside of our universe, outside of space and time, an infinite being of infinite power, omniscient, omnipotent, and so on. Okay, but what's the difference between that and a non-existent God? Either way, we can't measure it. If it's outside of space and time, it's not measurable. And therefore, there's no way to know if it really exists or doesn't, and you're stuck there in an epistemological trap. Okay, next slide. So my second point then, okay, look, what am I? I once saw a bumper sticker that said, militant agnostic. I don't know and you don't either. And I always liked that because I thought, you know what, it's actually a statement of humility before the great unknown. I don't know and you don't either. And so it ultimately comes down to, I think, just a question of matter of faith, if you want to take the leap of faith for that gap or not. I think, however, I don't like defining myself by what I don't believe. I believe all sorts of things. One of which I think there's actually positive evidence that concepts of God and religion were created by humans and not vice versa. For example, the last 10,000 years, there's been roughly, as an order of magnitude, about 10,000 different religions and about 1,000 different gods. That's a low number if we don't break it up into the finer sects of religions. What is the probability that Yahweh is the one true God, and Amun-Ra, Aphrodite, Apollo, Baal, Brahma, Ganesha, Isis, Mithras, Osiris, Shiva, Thor, Vishnu, Wotan, Zeus, and the other 986 gods are false gods? What do you think the chances are of the one that you believe is the right one, and all those other people that believed all those other gods just as fervently as you believe in your God, what do you think the chances are you got it right and they all got it wrong? Some of us just go one God further, because you're all atheists, just like me, of all the gods on that list except the one. By the way, I guess I shouldn't just assume anything. How many of you believe in God? Show of hands. Okay. I think my time's just about up. Oh my. And I would assume that those of you that held your hands up, you believe in Yahweh. Figure I can assume that. Next slide. In fact, it turns out where you happen to be born, that's just pure chance, determines which religion you believe in. Next slide. If you are born in the West, you probably believe that Christ is the Son of God, who is both man and both flesh and God. But next slide, and maybe you go to places like this, the Vatican. Next slide. On the other hand, if you're born in the East, you likely believe that Ganesha is God, and you might go, next slide, to places like this. It's a peninsula in India. This is a satellite photograph of so many people, millions of people at this beachside place. Next slide. In fact, most of the components of the religion that you adhere to have antecedents, cultural and historical antecedents. There's nothing original in the Judeo-Christian story. For example, virgin births are very common in mythology. Dionysus, Perseus, Buddha, Attis, Krishna, Horus, Mercury, Romulus, and Jesus. Take Dionysus, for example, the ancient Greek god said to have been born from a virgin woman, fathered by the King of Heaven, to have transformed water into wine, introduced the... That's why... Diana's the goddess of wine. Introduced the idea of eating and drinking the flesh and blood of God, was a liberator of his people, and to have returned from the dead. Next slide. Resurrection myths are also quite common and predate the Jesus story. Egyptian god of life, death, and fertility is Osiris. First appears in the pyramid texts about 2,400 years before the Christ resurrection story. Osiris is the giver of life in this world, the redeemer and merciful judge of the dead in the next world. Egyptian kings believed that as Osiris rose from the dead, so would they, in union with him, inheriting eternal life. See, initially the story was just the pharaohs get eternal life, and all the common people, they get nothing. But they found out that if you want them to actually build those pyramids for you, you got to offer them something, like eternal life if you'll just believe in the God. That's where the whole story comes from, accepting a Savior. It's a way of, well, you can see what it is. It's a way of getting people to build pyramids. Egyptian king, and by the new kingdom, in fact, everyone believed that if they accepted Osiris as God, they too would be resurrected from the dead. Next slide. In fact, the Jesus story is similar to other Greek and Roman myths. A divine being who becomes incarnate as a man enters into our world in order to perform miraculous deeds. In fact, Obi-Wan Kenobi of Star Wars was exactly like this kind of figure. Next slide. After Christ, the story continued. Apollonius of Tyana was a first century prophet at AD in Asia Minor. His followers claimed he was the Son of God, that he was able to walk through closed doors, heal the sick, cast out demons, and raise a dead girl back to life. He was accused of witchcraft, sent to Rome before the court, was jailed but escaped. After he died, his followers claimed he appeared to them and then ascended to heaven. Does it sound like a familiar story? It's a story that's repeated over and over and over throughout history, before the Jesus story, after the Jesus story. Next slide. The ghost dance of 1890 of the Paiute Indians. Again, it's another sort of destruction redemption story. It's a common theme in mythology, a resurrection story. Next slide. Flood myths are also common, not just in popular films with comedians. The Epic of Gilgamesh, 1800 BC. That's about 400 years before the Noachian flood story. And you, as you may recall from your history, the epic, the flood myths, the Babylonian god Ea warns that the gods were about to destroy all life by a flood. Nehushtan instructed him to build an ark, take aboard one pair of each living creature. This is 4 centuries before the biblical flood story. You might say that the story was floating around in the Mediterranean before it. In fact, most cultures that live on bodies of water that flood have flood myths. I'm constructing a historical, psychological, social cause of our belief in religion and God. Next slide. So many gods from which to choose. No wonder Yahweh is such a jealous God. The first 3 commandments of the 10 have nothing to do with morality. It's just God's a jealous God. I mean, really, a jealous God? That's like a Greek or Roman God, a God who is basically human but more advanced, like one of those ETIs I described. I mean, I've known people that get over jealousy. This is not what I think of when I think of a God who gives a moral law. A God who's jealous, who doesn't want you to believe other gods? What's wrong with that? Why would a God care about that? These I find disturbing problems in the theology. Next slide. Even if you go, okay, but just forget all those other gods. Yeah, we're atheists about those too. But even here, within the Abrahamic religions, Christians believe that Jesus is the Savior, but Jews don't. If you're so sure you're right, why do all those 13 million Jews who believe in the same God you believe, how come they don't accept that? And Muslims, of course, don't accept Jesus as the Savior either. Muslims believe the Quran is the perfect Word of God and that Muhammad is the latest prophet. Of course, Joseph Smith thinks he was the latest prophet of the Latter-day Saints. So many religions to choose from, so many gods, so little time. How do you know you have the right one? Next slide. So, not only is there absence of evidence, I think there's pretty good evidence for the absence of a God. That is, I think it's pretty obvious with just a cursory glance, just that Reader's Digest condensed version of history I just gave you, that we created the concept of gods and all the components of what gods do, their emotions, what they do for us, what we do for them. It has such an obvious human element and touch to it. And then in the first part, again, just to recap, if we did go in search of God, I don't think you can possibly, there's no possible experiment you can ever run to find the God that you likely believe in instead of what's the most we could hope to find, which would be some extraterrestrial power capable of creating things like cells and planets and universes. So with that, I think the best argument we have is that there very likely is no God, at least not the kind of God that you believe in. Thank you.
I've got 10 minutes.
With a 10-minute response and rebuttal, Richard Howe.
All right, well, good evening. I said that once, but I said it in a real scripted way the first time. So thank you for tolerating the regimented of my script to begin with. That's not normally my style, and probably my students back in Charlotte are all wondering, what got into Dr. Howe? It's like he's reading a manuscript. Because I never do that. But I needed to do that, if for no other reason, to make sure that the salient points I wanted to get across were made clearly, and I wasn't stumbling all over myself. So now is my chance to stumble all over myself when you do it in rebuttal time, because the rebuttal times are a little bit more open-ended. I don't think I'll have time to get to everything here, but let me just give it a stab. And these just come basically in the order in which Dr. Shermer brought up these points. First of all, he said, when we look around, we need to look for a natural explanation before we look for a supernatural explanation. As a professor of philosophy, I would like to ask the question, why? I'm not suggesting necessarily that that's always bad advice, that you should never do that. But what I'm interested in is, well, exactly what is going on in terms of your metaphysics and epistemology that shore up that methodology to say we always have to look for these natural explanations before we look to supernatural. And I'm curious as to, well, exactly how do you defend that claim? Perhaps we won't have time to get into it tonight, but I think it might be revealing to see exactly what are the assumptions that are being made as far as the metaphysics of the question and the epistemology of the question. In fact, I'll come back to that here in a minute. He brought up the issue of the God of the gaps argument. God of the gaps, if you're not familiar with that term, is, as he said, is when you have some space in your explanation of something, you posit God as the explanation. You know, they used to say that about the bumblebee. Well, a bumblebee supposedly defied the laws of aerodynamics. And so, how's the bumblebee fly? Well, Jesus makes the bumblebee fly. I mean, of course. And all the Christians were like, yay, Jesus makes bumblebees fly. If he could only keep them from stinging, maybe while you were at it, then they would be all right. Well, of course, they eventually find out that the bumblebee has a certain type of muscle mechanism in his body that enables him to flap his wings much more fast than they previously thought. He could displace enough air to displace his body weight. Lo and behold, we have this natural explanation. God of the gaps fallacy, two things that I think Dr. Shermer is exactly right on. There is a such thing as the fallacy, and you should not commit that fallacy. But I submit to you, I did not commit that fallacy tonight. Let me give you an example of what I think I'm trying to do in this project. Suppose you were investigating a fire. You're a detective and you're investigating a fire. And you eventually discover around the source of the fire in this home, there were burnt matches, there was an accelerant-soaked, partially burned rag right in the part of the house where the fire obviously started, and the fire burned conveniently one day after the owner took out this really high fire insurance policy. And so you put together that evidence and you conclude that you think an arsonist is responsible for the fire. But then the critic comes along and says, wait a minute, you're committing the arsonist of the gaps fallacy. Because what you're doing is you just need to look for a natural explanation before you start looking for some kind of intelligence. Because if maybe there's some law that we haven't discovered yet about fires that cause matches to burn exactly at the spot in the soaked rags, and and it'll be timed in such a way that it's just before the insurance policy was taken out. No, it's not that the detective is appealing to an arsonist because he has a gap in his theory. Say, well, I don't know how the fire started, so it must have been an arsonist. It's not a negative thing. He's actually positing the arsonist as an explanation of the evidence. So I'm not suggesting that God, since we don't know enough about physics and stuff, it looks like, well, maybe God did it. I'm not trying to argue that way. I'm saying this evidence looks like positive evidence that there is some kind of intelligence behind the creation and design of the universe and its moral reality. And that's what I'm positing that. So it's not a God of the gaps fallacy. Of course, the specter of, well, who created God came up, and if the arguments carry, then of course, who created God becomes a meaningless question because you're positing God as the uncreated God. Okay, well, that's fine. Maybe that somebody says, well, why should you do that? Well, it seems to me something's got to be uncreated. But it doesn't look like the universe is that, because the scientific evidence points to the fact that it began. And if you begin, then you're not uncreated. You were caused by something. So there must be something that caused the universe. Now, somebody say, well, maybe there's sort of a God prime, God prime, and then you got God double prime, and it keeps going out. That's fine, except that, as Aristotle said, if you have this infinite regress of explanations, that's tantamount to there not being an explanation at all. So I'm just positing some kind of hypothetical entity, we can call it God, that is the cause of the universe that itself is uncaused. Well, let's see where this may go. He says that God cannot be simple. Any being that is powerful enough to create the technicalities and intricacies of the biological world, not to mention the fine-tuning universe, cannot itself be simple. Well, why not? What I think the mistake this idea is making is predicated on this Darwinian notion that complexities arise from these prior causes, and so whatever was big enough to create the universe must itself be so complex that it would need to be something to be explained the way you're explaining this complexity. I just deny that. A mind, if you will, I can use that analogy for God, is not complex. For a coder to come up with machine language to code a computer, it doesn't, without argument, imply that somehow the mind of that computer programmer is itself complex like his code is. If you want to argue that it has to be complex, and by complex we don't mean difficult to understand, we mean composed of parts. Complex meaning it's made of parts. You have to give an argument as to why would a mind need to be composed of parts in order for a mind to be able to create something that is itself composed of parts. I just deny that that's a necessary condition. And so supposedly the ET then becomes indistinguishable from God. Well, what I've suggested is whatever this thing is some kind of hypothetical I'm positing, I'm calling it God, I believe that it is. But if it's the cause of the spatial, temporal, physical universe, then it's not spatial, temporal, or physical. Now, if you still want to call that an ET, I'll go, okay, well, I'll take that. I call it God, you call it ET. But if you're willing to grant there's some being that exists that is itself not physical, not temporal, and not spatial, and is transcendent to the universe, you can call it Bubba for all I care. Being from the Deep South, I might kind of like that. But I submit to you now it just becomes sort of semantic wrangling because I think, well, that's what people mean by God. That's just what we mean by this term. He alluded to the fact, or he didn't allude, he actually mentioned the fact that Stephen Hawking, among others, were scientists who flirt with this idea, my word, not his, about multi-universes and things. Just one quick thing about Hawking, particularly in his model, is in order for Hawking to make his model work in such a way that he eliminates what they call the cosmic singularity, which is the beginning point of the Big Bang Theory. In order for his model to work, by his own admission, he has to use what are known as imaginary numbers in his calculations. Now, imaginary numbers are fine. They have perfect application in electrodynamic theory and such. But I submit to you as a philosopher that once you introduce imaginary numbers, an imaginary number is the square root of -1 or some function thereof. Once you introduce imaginary numbers into the calculations, then your conclusions are no longer what philosophers call realist conclusions in terms of philosophy of science. There's a difference between realism and anti-realism, or sometimes called realism versus instrumentalism. And Hawking is an instrumentalist. By his own admission, he's a positivist. What that means is he says, I'm not trying to conclude things that I think this is the way the universe really is. What he means when he thinks this is the way the universe is, he means this is the way the mathematical equations are. And if the mathematical equations work, that's just what the universe is. And if you say, well, is that the way it really is? He would just go, that question doesn't make sense to me. Well, it doesn't make sense on a realist model because he's using imaginary numbers. You take the imaginary numbers out into Einstein's equations that he has to use, you get the singularity back. You get this starting point. And even other scientists like Alexander Vilenkin, for example, who are some of the pioneers of multi-universe, still argue that even multi-universes still are going to find themselves backing up against an absolute beginning, that it just can't go back forever physically. He says, if it's not measurable, it's not science. Well, is that claim measurable? Is that a measurable claim? How do you measure the claim, if it's not measurable, it's not science? Well, of course, that claim is a philosophical claim. I don't think Dr. Shermer is averse to making philosophical claims, and I, as a philosopher, sort of have a vested interest in people liking philosophical claims because I want them to make these philosophical claims. But what you have to be careful of is when we sort of weave in and out of these seemingly empirical scientific discussions, all of a sudden we just lapse over into some philosophical view, which itself doesn't have any philosophical arguments for. It doesn't have any sort of evidence. It's just put out there as a given, but yet it informs all the physical arguments. And if you're not careful, you're going to assume, well, that's just as valid as all the physical things he was saying. Thank you.
With a 10-minute response and rebuttal, Michael Shermer.
Okay. Well, so there's still those gaps. The 4 gaps that he began with: the universe started, it continues to exist, it looks designed, fine-tuned, etc. for life, and the moral law. Well, so Kant's starry heavens above and moral law within, very, very poetic. Those are still just gaps. It's still an argument from personal incredulity. Because I can't understand where morals come from, therefore they must come from somewhere else. Something like that. Okay, I'll address those one by one. First of all, on the naturalism, supernaturalism matter, why can't supernaturalism be invoked? Well, what would that look like? Let's take a slightly different subject that I began my little thought experiment with, and that's telepathy. Let's say that people really can read each other's minds. I'm skeptical of that, as you might guess. But let's say that it turns out they can. They could read the backs of playing cards and do the Zener card stuff and beat random number generators by thinking, things like that. And let's say we figured out how people do this. There's actually a theory by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff called quantum consciousness. That is, the theory goes roughly like this. In our neurons are these little scaffolds that sort of hold the cells together. And inside these little microtubules, these scaffolding, there are sort of quantum states created by something like a vacuum, in which the atoms that make up the chemicals inside your neurons are in sort of an indeterminate state until they fire. And then when they fire, and this is where the quantum mechanics part comes in, because of these sort of bizarre experiments that have been replicated over and over, and they're really true, that if you like spin an electron in one particular way, it affects electron some distance away instantly, which is not possible, but anyway, it's true. So maybe when I think a certain thought, it causes the little wave function of the to collapse inside the atoms in the molecules inside my neurons to go in a certain pattern that causes your neurons to fire in the same pattern. You read my thoughts. Okay, that's the theory. I don't believe it, but let's say it turned out to be true. That would no longer be telepathy. That would no longer be the paranormal. It wouldn't be the supernatural. It would just be quantum neuroscience. It would just be enveloped into science. It's no longer supernatural. It's just the natural. You see where I'm going with this? Once you sink your teeth into it and you measure it, and you actually have something to measure, then it's part of the natural world. And if it's not, it just disappears. People quit talking about it. There's nothing to study. It's invisible. It doesn't exist. All right? So that's why we can't invoke the supernatural, and God is just that. The concept of God is most commonly thought of. It's just a supernatural thing. How would we measure it? Say, take something like prayer. So prayer and healing is one of the claims often made for the inference to the existence of God. Well, okay, this has been studied scientifically now, and prayed for people in controlled experiments do no better than non-prayed for people. In fact, they do slightly worse for some bizarre reason. Apparently, when you find out that professional religious people are praying for you fervently, it makes people think, man, I must really be sick. It's like bringing the priest in with the last rites. Oh boy, this is not what I wanted to see, right? Well, in any case, there's no effect. Now, of course, people still think that they should pray for their loved ones when they're ill and hope a miracle happens, something like that. Okay, and maybe I can explain the miracles by statistical probabilities. 0.01% of the million people a year who get cancer have spontaneous remissions. That's 1,000 people a year. You see them on TV paraded in churches and so on as miracles. But statistically speaking, these things happen anyway. What you never see are miracles of things that wouldn't happen naturally. Cancers do sometimes go away. Amputated limbs never grow back. Never, ever, not once, ever, no matter how religious the people are who pray for them, no matter how deeply Christian the soldiers were who lost their limbs, they never grow them back, ever. That's a sign that the miracles don't exist, okay? So that's an example of a natural phenomenon that would, I don't know, convince me 100%, but, would make me pause. Like a $10 million deposit in a Swiss bank under my name. Well, maybe not in Switzerland anymore. Okay, so why does this universe look designed the way it is? Well, okay, here's one explanation. Okay, one explanation, God did it. Well, what do we do with that? It's sort of the end of the conversation. A second explanation is the multiverse I mentioned. So here's one possibility. We don't know if this is true or not, but that there are multiple universes. There's lots of universes. Any universe that has a particular configurations of the laws of nature like ours, that gives rise to stars and planets, also has stars that are big that collapse into black holes. When those black holes collapse into a point of singularity, they give birth to another little baby bubble universe because it's of the same universe as ours. The daughter is to the mother the same genetic similarity. In fact, so the laws of nature of the new universe will be similar to our laws of nature. So whichever one you happen to be born in, of course, like the person who wins the lottery, can't believe it, I won. Somebody's going to win if the numbers are big enough. There will be universes like ours that give rise to stars and planets and life and intelligence and so on, if the numbers are big enough. So that's the multiverse argument. Okay, that's it in short. There's no evidence for it yet, and there's no evidence for the God hypothesis either. So here's what you're faced with. So here we have a universe. God did it. Multiverse. I don't know. It's okay to say, I don't know. Most of us are not comfortable with that in most areas of our life. We like to have answers. But most of the time, we don't have final answers. Most of the decisions we make in life are made under great uncertainty because we have to get on with life. But I contend that there are some questions you don't really have to have the big answers to. It's okay to just say, I don't know how the universe began. Science is only a couple hundred years old. It was only a century ago in Los Angeles that Edwin Hubble, just at the top of Mount Wilson there, just above my house in Pasadena, discovered the expanding universe and that the Milky Way is not the only galaxy. That's only 100 years ago. We are just infants in understanding the universe. And so I think it's wise to be humble in the face of the great unknown and just say, you know what, we don't know, and that's okay. We'll just leave it sit there. Now, what makes people, my final point here, what makes people nervous about that is the morality question. Well, okay, not can atheists be as moral as theists. All the data shows that there's no difference. What you really want to know is what's the grounding of the moral values themselves? Is there something transcendent to you and I, just doing whatever we damn well please, if I can say that, in church. Well, I contend that in fact that there is. That we are an evolved social primate species in which we have to get along with one another. We have to cooperate. We have to be reciprocally altruistic and even genuinely altruistic. See, reciprocal altruism is I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. That sounds sort of calculating. I contend that that's not enough because people know if you're faking. People know, people that you can kind of trust and that you can't, people that are genuinely helpful and nice, and people that are just kind of faking it. So I'm claiming that in the long evolutionary history of our social species, it wasn't enough to pretend being a good group member. You have to actually be a moral person and do the right thing because everybody knows and your reputation really matters. And so not only do you need to convince other people you're moral, you need to convince yourself you're moral, and the best way to do that is to be a moral person. And so I contend that is given to us, granted to us as part of our genome, as it were, as part of our human nature. We also have a dark side, of course, but that's another debate on the question of evil. That too has an evolutionary origins. I actually think my theory of human nature is not so different from that of the Christian theory of human nature, but that's another question. And so I think, but in any case, even if you say, yeah, no, but somehow I get it from the Bible. No, I don't think you do. First of all, just read the Old Testament. And I contend that 99% of you in this room reject 99% of what's in the Old Testament. You would not stone to death disobedient children. You would not execute adulterous wives, but not the husbands. And things like this that are sort of Bronze Age moral myths. In fact, we've moved on. How do we do that? We do this by listening to the still small voice within and through the collective wisdom of the tribe as we progress over the centuries and the millennium. Thank you.
Now we'll have two shorter responses and rebuttals, a 5-minute rebuttal from Dr. Richard Howe.
Well, I think I will agree with you that we wouldn't concur with the stoning of the adulterous wives, but I think my mom, when I was littler, might have quarreled with you about the stoning of incorrigible children. She might have given you a run for your money on the wisdom of that. I can't top having Mount Wilson telescope in your backyard, but there's this like chicken restaurant near where I live in Atlanta that has this big giant chicken out front. So all the people in Atlanta go, I know where that is, in Marietta, Georgia. So that's about as good as I can do here. What I'd like to do in my 4.5 minutes here is touch on just some stuff that he said there, and then if I have any time left, go back to some things I couldn't get to in my first rebuttal. He says, why can't supernatural be involved? Well, what would that look like? And I'm curious what the ocular metaphor is asking me to answer. That is, what would it look like? If he means what would it look like in terms of what would it empirically look like, then I would just say, well, now that's part of the philosophical problem, is that we have this assumption that explanations must be ultimately empirical. I don't know that that's what he's saying, but I'm saying if that's what he meant, I would just deny that, first of all, but at least if that can't just be granted as without an argument. That's part of the philosophical argument that sort of is antecedent to this debate, is some of these issues about what do explanations look like, what kind of criterion must they fit in order to be a satisfactory explanation. And so I'm trying to sort of preempt this assumption of physicalism that sometimes is sort of infused through a lot of these debates, that people are sort of intoxicated with the fact that an explanation has some kind of physical dimension to it. If it has some other thing like philosophically, what would it look like? Well, I thought that what I was arguing was an example of that, but that remains to be seen in your considered judgment over the arguments tonight. I'm surprised at this. Well, I was glad to hear you say that you didn't believe in this quantum consciousness idea. I think that is not tenable. I think it would have problems with the notion of free will. You can't get free will out of quantum Heisenberg indeterminacy. That's not the same as the philosophical notion of free will, and I think there must be some robust notion of free will to make sense out of the question of morality, not to mention the fact that if our mental states are the result of antecedent brain states, then I submit to you, without argument because of the constraints of time, but I submit to you that if our belief states are merely the result of antecedent brain states, then it does violence to the whole concept of what it means for a belief to be true. And I would just challenge you that it would no longer make sense to say, my view on this is true, if your view on that is just the result of an antecedent brain state. Surprisingly, maybe to some people, I would concur with what I think I heard Dr. Shermer say regarding the idea of miracles. One of the things that we try to teach our students at the seminary is that miracles are not an argument for the existence of God. They could never be philosophically, because no matter what physical event occurred, no matter how anomalous it may appear, it's always possible, as a theoretical, it's always possible that was caused by some unknown law, or maybe it's a fluky thing that only every 2,000 years does somebody come back from the dead when Halley's Comet comes around, and it just happened. I think that's plausible philosophically. So what we try to argue at the seminary is that you have to give arguments for the existence of God before you can use miracles in any kind of argument for a broader issue regarding the truth of the Christian faith. As I suggested in my first rebuttal, the multi-universe, and I've got some resources I would commend to your reading if you're interested in some of those. I think even the pioneers of the multi-universe do one of two things. They either ultimately admit that multi-universe stuff still doesn't get around the ultimate cause question, the finite past, or it becomes so speculative that it isn't any less outrageous sounding to me than what I think my notion of God sounds to you as a skeptic or an atheist. Now, just a couple of things in 40 seconds that he mentioned. He says he believes in one less God than you do. So I'm an atheist or agnostic. You believe in a bunch of gods. Well, all the reasons you have for not believing in all those other gods than Yahweh, then I just do one more. The problem with that argument is that argument would undo anything that you believe in terms of controversy. You say, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in government. So you believe in democratic capitalism or whatever. Well, I just believe in one more form of government than you do. So all the reasons you give against all these other theories of government, I use that against your theory. Well, no. That wouldn't work as an argument against democratic capitalism. And the idea that I believe in one more God than you do doesn't work against the arguments for the one true God.
Time.
Thank you.
With a 5-minute response rebuttal before our intermission, Dr. Shermer.
Wow, how did we get into democratic capitalism? I believe in both of them. Thank you. Yeah, he read my book. Yeah, I believe in democratic capitalism. I'm a liberal conservative. Libertarian, fiscally conservative, socially liberal. Anyway, so, okay, I forgot on the arsonist fire thing. The reason that argument doesn't work, arsonist, fire, God, universe, is that we have vast experience with arsonists. We know people start fires. We know about firebugs, people that just love watching fires. Some whack job did this in Southern California, right in my hills, just below Mount Wilson. Almost burned down Mount Wilson last August. One guy started the fire. So we have experience with them. We lock them up. We have nothing like that for God. That is, or an intelligent designer or whatever. We have no empirical data, no visible, there he is making the tools. We can see people make stone tools. We can infer that ancient hominids made stone tools. They're the tools and so forth. They're the bones. We have nothing like that for God. We just have the artifacts. We don't have the artificer, the maker. We got nothing. Well, not quite. Second point on the design argument. The snowflake, everybody agrees, that happens naturally. You don't need the intelligent designer to come into our universe and stir the particles for every single snowflake. That just happens naturally, and everybody agrees. It has to do with the laws of chemistry and the bonding molecules and so forth, the temperature, whatnot. So to get from snowflakes to DNA, it's the same principle. You're just ramping up the levels of self-organized emergent complexity from simpler models. And we already do this. You all know how this is done. With language, for example, with economies and markets. Nobody designs markets, as you can tell very well. Right? They just happen on their own. They self-organize. They emerge just out of you and I trying to make a living and take care of our families and improve our lives by trading. It's what Adam Smith said, basically. You don't need a top-down designer. In fact, it tends to muck the system up, as you may have noticed, when the Fed manipulates the interest rates too much one way or the other. Bubbles and bursts happen. Okay, so language. No one designed language, the English language, to sound like it does today, different from in Shakespeare's time and different still from Chaucer's time. Nobody designed English like where I live, where they use the word like every 3 words. You would not design a language like that from the top down. Language, like markets, are self-organized emergent properties. They're complex systems that evolve out of simpler systems. Snowflakes become DNA. They really do. And we have a pretty good understanding now of where DNA comes from RNA and the pre-RNA world and so on. It's a much harder problem to solve than, say, economics. Well, maybe not. But it's still a hard problem to solve. Snowflakes, we got. DNA, we're almost there. But it's a ramping up. You still don't need the... But even if you insist on the intelligent designer or God stepping into the system once in a while to stir the particles, how does he do this? What forces does he use to do this, to create? We saw the people who made Mount Rushmore. We could see them, how they made it. Where's the process we can observe of a deity, an intelligent designer making cells? Nothing like that. But even if you think that that must have happened, how do you think that happened? Do you have any idea what forces did he use? Electromagnetism, gravity, weak or strong nuclear force, some electrochemical bonding processes? What processes did God use? And when? Does he step in just for the Big Bang, and then maybe the Cambrian explosion, and then maybe the rise of mammals, and then Homo sapiens, and then us? Does the deity intervene for every one of us? Every single birth? What about every natural abortion? Did the deity intervene and create that as well? How about every single cell in the trillions of cells in your body? Does the deity create every one? And you see where I'm going. Once you start down the road of, I gotta invoke a deity to close a gap, how many of those gaps are you gonna invoke? How does it happen? And so on. I think the more prudent answer is, it just happens naturally from the bottom up. There are still mysteries we have yet to explain. Thank you.
All right. It is time to go back to work, back to the salt mines. But isn't this fun? Hey, again, as we resume and reconvene, and we'll get to the questions, for our presenters, for their hard work and for their communication, for this incredible facility, incredible staff, Church for All Nations, the people at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and the dynamic leadership of Dr. Mark Coward. Again, could we just have a hand and an appreciation for all of these people? Indeed, indeed. And thank you here and those watching and all of the great questions. Very substantive. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. I'm just going to sit over here where I can monitor the computer. I'll ask our presenters. They can just stay where they are with their notes, and we'll get to the questions. And first, we are going to go to Dr. Howe. I'm going to pull this one out. This question was Skyped in. It says, Dr. Howe.
Never been Skyped before.
Well, tonight is the night.
Moment. Okay, I'm fine. Thank you.
And thus you have been Skyped. Dr. Howe, when you used the arsonist analogy to refute the God of the Gaps argument, you imply that an arsonist isn't a natural process.
Right.
How is a human action not a natural process? From Jason. Jason,
All right,
thank
now,
you.
do I answer from here, or do I have to go to the podium?
No,
or?
just from where you are.
Okay.
I think that would be
all
safe.
right. I think it is on. Is my mic on?
Okay.
Sorry. Well, the question. Are you taking this from my time here? No, okay. Do I even get time? That's what I want to.
Let's be concise.
The question, I think, raises an important ambiguity that I think exists in the debate over intelligent design, and that is the ambiguity of the word natural, because the word natural can actually be contrasted with two different things. Something could be natural in the sense that it's not supernatural. Supernatural meaning transcendent to the universe like God. But natural also can be contrasted with artificial or intelligent or designed. And so the argument I was making there was, is I'm trying to argue that there's an intelligence as the causal explanation for certain features in the design of the universe, the information in the coding, the DNA, that kind of stuff. I'm arguing for intelligent causality. That's what the arsonist was trying to illustrate, that it was an intelligent cause, because as the fire detectives would say, if they thought it was a natural cause, they don't mean that the arsonist is supernatural. If they said, well, it wasn't a natural cause, so it must have been a supernatural arsonist. No, what they mean is it wasn't a natural cause, meaning it wasn't the consciousless forces of nature. It was an intelligence that caused the fire. That was the analogy's point.
I want to get one of the questions. This was emailed in for Michael Shermer. Says, Dr. Shermer, wouldn't the inherent similarities of the different religions add to rather than detract from their veracity?
Well, my point in showing all those different themes is that there's nothing particularly unique about the one that most Americans believe in. And it has antecedents preceding it, so clearly they're socially constructed. I mentioned that civilizations that exist on bodies of water that flood tend to have flood myths, and those that live in the desert without bodies of water don't have flood myths. So something like that would be an example of like a geographical determination of a myth, something like that. And so what we find in the similarities between myths is that there's only so many ways to spin a story. There's tragedies and comedies and romances and so on. There's only 7 plots in Hollywood. You've all heard that little one-liner, but it's kind of true. There's only so many ways. That's restricted by the way the brain is structured. There's only so many ways to tell a story based on human nature and what we write about, what we like to write about of human relationships and love and tragedy and conflict and so forth. And that's what produces those stories. So if anything, the similarity just shows that even more how culturally bound and determined by human nature those stories are, coming from within rather than from without.
This is a question for Dr. Richard Howe. It says, since there are so many different sects of Christianity and the Bible is interpreted in so many different ways, can the Bible be taken as the absolute?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it could be taken as the, quote, absolute, if I understand what the questioner means by the word absolute. I mean, I believe the Bible is revealed truth from God. I believe it is inerrant in the original autographs. But arguments to that end are incredibly complex in my experience. Certainly don't lend themselves very easily to the regiments of a debate situation like this, much less a quick off the top of my bald head response to, was that a tweet or was that a Skype? It really makes a difference in how you answer, don't you think? Because I've never been tweeted, so I'm kind of looking forward to that moment.
Yes, it was a tweet.
Okay, well, there you go. Now I've been tweeted. I feel better. But that's a serious question. I realize, and there's just no way to do it justice in just a quick response to a question. So I think I have things to say when I teach my courses about alternative interpretations and different sects and these kind of things. I think a lot of those have philosophical explanations in terms of impinging influences from culture, from other philosophies. That cause the Bible to be taken one way as opposed to another. That's why we put such an emphasis on philosophy at our seminary, because we think a lot of these problems that may look so disparate at one level actually reveal a common ground underneath them in terms of some basic issues in metaphysics and epistemology. And I think a lot of times we need to just push those questions down to go, what's the real problem here? Are you dealing with a Lockean representationalism? Are you going to be a Platonic recall? Are you going to be a Thomistic moderate realist? Are you going to be a Occamist nominalist? I mean, what are you going to be? And how do you adjudicate those kind of things? Well, however that parses out philosophically, I think it impinges on these more remote questions about, different Bible interpretations and such. Now, let me just ask you, if I may, Dr. McFarland. Dr. Shermer didn't get a chance to respond to my just incredible statement earlier about natural, and I didn't know if each of us, you wanted us to respond to the other person's comment, or we just didn't have enough time to do that. But
why don't we save that for
okay, all right.
the final?
All right, I just want to make sure.
Each of you has a final statement if you'd
all
like to. Dr. Howe, you've been tweeted, so as not to leave out Dr. Shermer, you too have been tweeted. And here it is, Dr. Shermer. It says, this is from the United States. Can you name any previous human culture that did not believe in a God?
Well, I mean, certainly hunter-gatherer societies today believe in all sorts of gods, but they're not at all like the God that you believe. These are sort of animistic spirits that are barely different from you and I. They have very human attributes. They're good, they're evil, they're jealous, they're nasty, they're nice. They cause diseases, they cause storms, and so forth. So if you want to say they all believe in God, well, kind of. I mean, what they believe is that there's intentional agency out there. There are intentional agents invisible intentional agents doing all sorts of nasty and good things, running the world and making things happen, diseases and storms and whatnot. That's sort of what most people believe before they become civilized and get a polytheistic pantheon of gods and then narrow it down to one God. That's sort of the trajectory historically. So I would contend that, in fact, inferring intentional agency on the part of invisible beings out there running the world, that's what our brains do. And I actually call this agenticity, the tendency to find intentional agents out there doing things. And I think there's a natural inclination of why we do that. But that's very different from whether there actually really is an intentional agent out there, which I contend there isn't.
Dr. Howe, this is from a U.S. viewer. It says, you say that science cannot explain free will. Biochemistry can explain almost all human brain activity. Do you propose some sort of, quote, God neuron?
No, I didn't say that science couldn't explain free will. I said that free will couldn't be reduced to antecedent brain states. I didn't necessarily think that meant science couldn't explain it, whatever that means for science to explain it. So, but yes, I would deny that human actions and beliefs can be entirely explicated in terms of neurons and synapses and dopamine and these things. But it doesn't. It's a false dilemma to say that if I deny that these things are reducible to brain states, that therefore I have to have some type of deity. I'm not sure if that's a code, the God neuron, maybe that is reference to something I'm not familiar with. But I think there's other options like the idea of the soul, that somehow there's an aspect to my being as a human that is non-physical. And so I would try to relegate at least some amount of my brain activity, some amount of my mental activity to being caused by this, by me, by a soul. So it doesn't have to be, or it can't be, I think, explained entirely in terms of antecedent physical brain states. Otherwise, otherwise the statement, mental states are reducible to antecedent brain state, that statement becomes meaningless, because then it just becomes the result of an antecedent brain state, and so the idea of it being true or false is a meaningless. You can't say whether it's true or false, because it'd be like saying, is a cumulus cloud true or false? Well, that doesn't even make sense. It's just a physical state. So how can a physical state be true or false? It doesn't make sense.
Dr. Shermer, this is from Jim, Skyped in. What motivation does an atheist have for morality besides just getting along with your fellow man?
Which I'm very glad he's committed to morality, by the way, so.
Well, me too, for you. But I'm a little worried, if you don't believe in God anymore, is that the end of your morality? Really? I mean, don't you think you should be good for its own sake? Because that's a better way to treat people? Rather than because I read it in a book, or I'm hoping to get into heaven, or I'm hoping to gain points with the Creator, or I'm hoping to be praised by the Creator. Don't you think that moral values in and of themselves stand alone, without any outside source? And you still have the problem that I mentioned. If you think that morals come from on high, how are you getting them? Through prayer? Through reading the holy book? Which holy book? Unfortunately, there's many. The creator of the universe wrote several books, and you have to pick which is the right one. Most of you, I assume, are not Muslim, but if we were in a Middle Eastern Muslim country, this would have a very different ring to it, wouldn't it? And they have very different values than you have, which they also get from on high and believe just as strongly as you do. Now, maybe their attitudes toward women were not so different from Christian attitudes toward women, say, 2 centuries ago. But Christianity had something of an enlightenment, and it evolved, whereas Islam, at least parts of Islam, have not yet. And that's why we have a clash of civilizations that you may have noticed that we're going through. Well, so I'm still not convinced in the least that you can get morals from on high. You still get them from within and from the process we all go through. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that women couldn't vote. And just before that, blacks couldn't vote. And blacks and women were barely even considered citizens. Barely better than a cow as property. And yet we've moved on. There's nothing about that in the Bible. We did that because it's a better way to treat people. And it's a better way for us all to live.
I just have to comment, I'm so thankful for this country, a pluralistic country in which we can discuss these things. Dr. Shermer said if we were doing this in a Muslim country, it would have a different ring to it, and I'm afraid that ring would probably be gunfire. And isn't it good that we can discuss and dialogue and interact with free discourse and no bloodshed? Dr. Richard Howe, a U.S. viewer wants you to comment on Pascal's wager. And it's not exactly a question, but the merits or demerits, the validity or lack thereof of Pascal's wager.
Well, it comes up often. Pascal's wager basically is taken to be that if you bet that there is a God and there's not, once you're dead and it turns out there's not a God, you've really lost nothing, seemingly. But if you bet that there is not a God, that is, you take a chance and then you find out you were wrong and there really is a God afterwards, then you've lost everything. And I think taken in that sort of out of context way, I think the criticisms that are leveled against it by free thinkers and stuff is warranted, because the wager wouldn't work. You can't just say, well, do you bet there's a God or not? If you bet that there's Yahweh, that's one thing whether you die or not, but if you bet on Allah, it's a completely different thing. And then if it's neither of those, so the permutations are almost limitless as far as which God are you going to bet on. So I think the argument doesn't work, and I hear even sometimes Christians do that. We actually had a radio show once where we dealt with arguments that we thought Christians should never use because they're just bad arguments, and I think that's one of them. However, in Pascal's defense, I would submit to you that that's not what Pascal was arguing in context. In his Pensées, he was arguing. He had actually done a lot of what we would call apologetics prior to that, and he set up a much more narrow field within which the wager was proffered. So it wasn't just offered as just out of nothing. God, no God. It was in a context where he had already honed what he thought were the live options, and then he offers the wager.
Dr. Shermer, this is an interesting question. This is from Benjamin, watching live in Europe. Thank you for this, Benjamin. It's a lengthy question, and I want to read it in its entirety. Born and lived in a communist country and trained in atheistic natural science schools there, I'm trying to find an atheist with any evidence for life coming out of non-life. So far, I find atheists who believe life came out of nothing by nobody, but have no evidence for it. Usually, their arguments assume intelligence or life, which just proves the opposite. What is your evidence, please? Thank you, from Europe.
Okay, so this is the origin of life question. Does life come from nothing? Well, obviously not. Something has to come from something. So it depends how far back you want to go, all the way to the Big Bang. Okay, then we have to explain the Big Bang. But he's just starting with something else, like a cell or something like that. Well, obviously a cell doesn't just come out of nowhere. So again, back to my examples of the self-organized emergent properties, from ratcheting up from snowflakes or beehives, or pick any crystalline structures, basic simple structures that no intelligent design creationist thinks we need to invoke the deity for. They just happen naturally. Just ratchet on up to there. All the way, I mentioned DNA, but it doesn't have to be DNA. It could be mitochondrial. By the way, there's DNA inside mitochondria. How weird is that? Not so weird, because the kind of cells that you and I are made out of, eukaryotic cells, have little organelles that were once prokaryotic, simpler cells that converged. This sort of self-organized emergence into complex systems is what happens when you just throw energy into a system, energy, say, from the sun. Right? So we have a pretty good understanding of this, although the origins of life science is relatively new, maybe only half a century. There's not that much research dollars for it, so there's only maybe a dozen or so labs that study this professionally. So there's maybe half a dozen different theories to answer that question. So rather than my just making up one story and selling it to you, I'll tell you like a scientist. We have about 6 different theories of how this could have happened. And more research will get us down to 3, 2, 1, and then a general consensus of how it happened. But we have a ways to go on that.
For Richard Howe, this is from Jocelyn. Would you consider the ultimate basis of your argument to be faith?
No. Oh, sorry.
Okay, and on we go.
No, I think the sort of popular notion of how faith and reason are juxtaposed is really not very healthy. Faith is generally regarded as something internal, subjective, private, emotional, and reason is generally characterized as public, objective, scientific. That I think is certainly not a classical notion of the distinction between faith and reason. Classically, in the Christian tradition, faith and reason are contrasted in this way. Reason is believing things on the basis of demonstration. Now, what constitutes a demonstration would vary as to what is being demonstrated. A historical demonstration is different than a mathematical demonstration, is different than a chemical, but demonstration nonetheless. Faith is accepting something on the basis of authority, where you trust somebody in terms of what they say. I submit to you most of what, at least I think most of what we believe in this room regarding the technical sciences, we believe by faith in the sense that we've judged by reason that a particular authority is credible, who tells us what the speed of light is. I submit you've never had the speed of light demonstrated to you, so you don't believe it by reason, classically, in terms of the classical way that's understood. You believe it because you trust what you've judged by reason to be a credible authority who tells you what the speed of light is, who's demonstrated it. That's what faith is. So faith is not some kind of caulk that fills in the gaps that reason leaves behind. It's merely the choice to decide whether you think a resource is credible, and you make that choice on the basis of reason, and then you accept it by faith. So I tried to make most of my arguments based on an appeal to authorities like the astronomers and scientists of other sorts. And so I don't think it's based on faith even in the classical sense, except for this appeal to scientific authority.
Dr. Shermer, someone has emailed in, do you think that you have a soul, and what do you think will happen to that soul after death?
Yes, I do. And I'm going to the good place, I hope.
What is that, Pasadena?
I mean, yeah, maybe.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I find the whole concept of if you believe, you get to go to heaven. By belief, I mean believe in the right God, accept Christ as your Savior. Otherwise, you're out. Except for maybe the Jews, because, they suffered enough. We'll let them in the club. I find that really disturbing. I mean, whether I believe or not, what difference does that make to God? Why would he care? What kind of God would care about that? A God who is like a human God, like a Greek or Roman God maybe, jealous, angry, petty. That can't be the God that you guys believe in. Can't be. So if there is such a God, I would think that he would care more about how you comported yourself in your life, how you treated other people, what kind of person you were, what kind of character you had. This is the faith versus works argument. I'm right there in the camp of it's works that gets you there. I don't even believe that, but if that was the case, surely that matters more than being a real son of a bitch and 5 minutes to go, you accept Christ and you're in the club. Come on, that can't be right. That just doesn't make sense if you think about it. That can't be right, right? So that's my opinion on that. I don't think I have a soul, unless you mean by soul the pattern of information that represents who you are. Well, yeah, sure, of course I have a soul. At the moment, I don't think there's any way to transfer that pattern of information to some long-term medium. But those Google guys are working on this, I think. Those tech guys may figure this out. They're pretty smart. That Moore's law of doubling computing power every 18 months. Eventually, they would be able to replicate an entire human, including all your thoughts and so on, it's a big computer hard drive, really big. But it's just a matter of time with quantum computing. I don't know. So I'm not really being facetious. I mean, I really think that could be possible. But at the moment, no, I don't think I have the kind of soul that probably the person asking thinks.
This will probably be the last question that we have time for in this segment, and it goes to Richard Howe. This was Skyped in from Jason. Dr. Howe, you've made a lot of arguments for the existence of God tonight, but all of your arguments could apply to any God. What are your arguments for the existence of Yahweh as opposed to other gods such as Zeus?
He's right. My arguments would, in a very meaningful way, apply to any God. That's by design, no pun intended. That is to say, I deliberately am trying to define God in a way that the subject can be meaningfully negotiated within these regimented time slots. Okay, so if someone is willing to grant for me just God in some kind of sense of it's a personal, immaterial, spaceless, timeless being transcended to the universe of unimaginable power, I'll take that. If they don't think it's Yahweh, that's fine with me. We can work on the Yahweh versus Allah versus Bubba thing under another context. That's fine. And again, I'm not trying to be facetious. It's just that you can't prove everything that one wants to say about God, or even argue everything that I would want to say about God in such a regimented and short time. And that sounds like a cop-out. It's just to say that's a tough issue. Then we would start, if a person believed there was a God, then I would begin to give arguments to the effect that the Bible is a historically reliable document, not unlike other documents from the ancient world. On the basis of that, I would try to build the case historically as to who Jesus is and try to show that Jesus is this God in flesh. And then I would use Jesus in terms of being God in the flesh as an authority to argue for what the Bible is as the inspired Word of God, and it would give us the identity of Jesus. So sort of a spiraling argument rather than maybe circular. That's how it would do. You obviously can't do that in a short period of time. In fact, to teach a whole course on it during a whole semester that you're invited to take, even distance. You can do it distance education. You don't have to move to Charlotte.
SES.
Now, did I get one more question than he did? Or did I? I want to make sure I wasn't being unfair.
You know, we did begin with you, but we're out of time on this segment, and it's time for the closing arguments. Each presenter will have 5 minutes to give a closing argument, and time will be copiously observed. Dr. Richard Howe, you go first, and Dr. Shermer will have the final word.
Well, you know, if you notice, I don't know if it's printed that our pictures are on. Is it printed somewhere? I saw it on the thing up there, our pictures. You know, when they do things like that, you have pictures of people looking one way or the other. They have to make them both looking in, which meant they had to reverse one of the pictures. And as they were thinking about it, they realized that putting the part on the wrong side of the head wouldn't be as big a problem for reversing my picture than maybe your picture. So, although, as I think about it, just a couple of things here before I revert to my script here and thank the people that need to be thanked. A couple of things that I just wanted to mention. One of the things to be careful of that I tell my students when people ask how questions, that's H-O-W, not H-O-W-E. I like H-O-W-E questions, but when people say, well, how did you do that? You have to be careful that a how question is not committing what philosophers call a category mistake. When you ask how a internal combustion engine works, you're basically asking the person to explain the mechanism of the internal combustion engine in terms of its components. You break it down. But eventually, if you get to something that is itself simple, that is, it's not made of something more fundamental, then to ask how is that is to ask a category mistake. So I think it's a category mistake to ask, well, how did God do the things that He did? Well, there is no how. God didn't do some kind of thing, and then there's a universe, you know, and then there's life. I don't think that happened at all. I think it's just as simple that God just wills it. You can do those kind of things when you're omnipotent. But it's like asking somebody, well, how does matter take up space? How would you answer that? How does matter take up space? It just takes up space. That's just what it does. That's what you do when you're matter. There's not something matter goes through, the summation of which is taking up space. You just take up space if you're matter. Well, how does God create life? You just create life. You just cause it to be. If you are a being whose essence it is to exist, then you can cause the existence of anything that you choose to do. So I think how questions are illicit. Also, I would encourage you, this wasn't the topic of the debate tonight, but it's come up several times in terms of the similarities between Christianity and the other religions. I noticed it was very interesting to me that Dr. Shermer appealed to the fact that the similarities of all the religions seem to bespeak of their cultural common origins. But when someone said, well, can you give me a civilization that didn't believe in God? He said, well, you know, the hunter-gatherers, but they believe in a God. But it's not anything like the God you believe in. Well, I thought it was all the similarities is what caused the fact that they had a similar origin, namely in culture. But now all of a sudden, when it comes to the nature of God, we start finding, well, they're not really that similar after all. What the Christians were posing, what the Jews were posing, was metaphysically a very different kind of being than what you find in terms of Zeus or Isis or all the these others. They're different in terms of what you think their nature is like. And so what I would encourage you to do, at least one book that would defend my point of view, and Dr. Shermer can perhaps suggest some resources that would defend his, but I would commend to your reading the book by Ronald Nash originally titled Christianity in the Hellenistic World, and it was republished entitled The Gospel and the Greeks. And he argues, and you decide whether you think his arguments are valid, that these accusations that you have all of these myths that sound alike in all these religions is just factually not true. It's just not the case that you have these resurrection stories that are permeated the ancient Near Eastern religions. Read Nash's thesis and see whether you think his counter to that is plausible. I would like to thank everyone for tonight, this opportunity to be here, especially Church for All Nations. And boy, I tell you, they could write a textbook on how to put on a debate in terms of the amount of work they've done. So thank you so much for letting me be a part of it. So we've heard evidence for and against theism and agnosticism. The attention is so often drawn to this issue bespeaks of how profound the question of God's existence has seemed to most humans tonight. And perhaps this is because many people have sensed that God has a greater claim on their lives than anything else possibly could. Perhaps many find this claim haunting, if not terrifying. Nietzsche is reported to have said, if you were to prove this God of the Christians to us, we should even less be able to believe in Him. Others have testified throughout history that God is their liberator, Savior, and reason for being. And which side do you come down on? Certainly many questions are still to be examined, even if God's existence is proven. What is His name? Is it Allah, Jesus, Yahweh, whatever? For those who are undecided, I encourage you to continue to examine the issue for yourself. Read widely, both atheists and theists. Read Dr. Shermer's books if you are a Christian. They deserve to be heard, and listen to the arguments and make the decision for yourself. Thank you.
With his final word, Dr. Michael Shermer.
Spoken like a true skeptic, I make you an honorary member of the Skeptic Society. I'll even give you my little gold pin here. Well, it's about 1 angstrom's worth of gold. I think it's pretty thin. Anyway, so a couple things on Dr. Howe defined faith as belief in authority. Well, that's not quite right, I think, because it's true I haven't measured the speed of light myself, but I can track back who did. Michelson and Morley did. They did it right up there, and yet again in Southern California, between 2 mountain peaks, and it's been tested and retested. I can see the equipment that they did it on. I can read the original paper. I can look at the raw data. You can actually track back the source, and there it is. So it's not that I have faith in some textbook or some physicist who's alive today, and I don't have to check it. I can check it. What would be the equivalent of that for the resurrection? There's nothing like that. It's just an article of faith. You just either believe it or you don't. And most people in the world today don't. It's true, 1 billion do. That's a lot. But there's almost 7 billion people. Okay, 2 billion if you count others. That's still so less than maybe a quarter. So obviously you can't prove it. And how would you prove it anyway? Right? Because maybe he wasn't dead. Or if somebody was resurrected here on the stage right before me to convince me, come on, Shermer, Mr. Skeptic. Well, I might think, David Copperfield or Penn and Teller did some trick, and he wasn't really dead, and they made him look dead, something like that. And I suspect you would think the same thing, right? Because if you didn't, it would mean anybody could be resurrected, and that would gut the core of your belief that only one person has ever been resurrected as the Son of God. So I do think that's an article of faith dramatically different from anything, the confidence we have in the authority of science, because you can check it yourself. I think it's good to make a distinction in belief statements. I believe in a flat tax because I think it's fairer than a progressive tax. And, well, maybe in this city I'd have a lot of support. But in LA, I'm kind of a lone voice there. But that's kind of a political belief statement, not something you can run an experiment on. It depends what your goals are of a society. And that's very different, that kind of belief statement, than I believe the germ theory of disease. I believe that germs cause disease. HIV causes AIDS, for example. And that isn't like a flat tax belief. That is a testable hypothesis. It's either true or not. Either the earth goes around the sun or it doesn't. It's either getting warmer or it isn't. And so forth. These are these are in principle testable ideas we can actually get an answer to. And I contend that religious questions are more like the first set, the political beliefs. I believe this, you believe that, and the world is a big enough place for us to go about our separate ways as long as you don't fly planes into buildings over it. And unfortunately, not everybody thinks that, obviously. I do think how questions are legitimate for religion. Why can't I ask, how did God do it? What kind of an answer is, he willed it? What does that even mean? If I said, the earthquake happened in Southern California, and you said, well, how did it happen? Well, the earthquake, God's just willed it. You would not be satisfied with that answer. You'd want to know, well, how does it happen, dang it? Because we want to be able to predict them and so forth. I don't see why, in principle, that couldn't apply to religious questions. And once you bump into some of those, like the resurrection, you see, well, there can't be an answer. Not a natural answer. If it is, then it can happen naturally, and there's nothing special about it. If it's supernatural, we can't actually measure it. So we really do hit an epistemological wall there. You can't get past that. Okay. I was once a born-again evangelical Christian. I know what it means to believe. I lost my belief for a whole variety of reasons that I won't go into in 42 seconds. But just to say, I completely get why people believe. I understand it. I believed myself for 7, almost 8 years. And I don't believe now, and yet life goes on. And so for me, I think the higher moral principle is to expand the circle of sentiments for more people to be considered fully human everywhere on the planet, that we're all a member of the same tribe, so to speak, to attenuate tribalism and expand that. The two best ways of doing this, tested ways, are democracy and capitalism or trade, and that, to whatever extent religion does help that along, great, but that's something we should all work toward, expanding the circle of sentiments. Thank you.
They're going to excuse themselves off to the back. They'll be in the lobby in a few moments, but we've got just a couple of things to say as we conclude. And before I turn it back over to Dr. Mark Cowart again, I want to say how thankful I am for him and the hospitality of his church. As I was listening to the two men share the different bits of information and the research and the things that they've studied and uncovered, I was thinking about this. In my grad program, I minored in developmental psychology, and one of the things we studied were some of the things that human beings inquire about and grapple to find answers to. And there are, in a general sense, 3 intellectual questions with which the human mind grapples, 3 emotional issues or longings or great probing questions. Mentally, we wonder about origin, purpose, destiny. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we headed? Origin, purpose, destiny. Emotionally, the heart longs for these things, though we might not articulate it as such or really clearly define it this way. But even from childhood, we emotionally, psychologically crave acceptance, significance, and security. Acceptance is the question, do I fit in? Do I belong? And we've all known what it was like to feel ostracized or like we didn't belong. Significance, do I matter? Does my life account for anything? And all of us have done things to try to feel significant or to try to feel like we matter. And we will, in fact, bend over backwards and even stretch ourselves and even do things that are at-risk behaviors to try to feel significant and try to fit in. And then once we begin to do that and achieve those things, we wonder about security. Am I safe? Will I hang on to the things I've accomplished? I've earned a few trophies. How do I keep them nice and polished so they don't tarnish? What does tomorrow hold? And maybe some of you know what it's like to lie awake and wonder in the wee hours of the morning, what really does the future hold? And so tonight, inasmuch as this was initiated by a church group and a Christian seminary, I guess I would leave you with the thoughts of C.S. Lewis, who posited that origin, purpose, destiny, acceptance, significance, security can be answered to varying degrees and with varying degrees of success by any of the belief systems. But Lewis said, and some of the best and the brightest in history would concur, from Augustine to Aquinas to Anselm, through C.S. Lewis, and more recently people like even Ravi Zacharias or Lee Strobel. And the fact that some of the best and the brightest have espoused this in no way nails shut the case in the affirmative, but it is worth giving serious consideration to. But Lewis said, a creator God who gives meaning to life and loves each person this much, knows every one of our names, and cares this much about each individual, that had you been the only one who ever lived, he would have done the necessary things to rescue you from your fallen, lost, culpable, sinful predicament. That God loves us, the greatest thought to pierce the mind of the human being. And Lewis said this, he said, each person has the same amount of time in which to decide for this loving God and to respond to his overtures. Lewis said, some object, why did one die young? Why did one live to be old? Lewis said, no, we all have the same amount of time in which to adjudicate and decide, a lifetime. And Lewis said that the question that we make so theoretical, so hypothetical, what about this person, what about that? Lewis warned against procrastination and said it's not about the possible salvation or damnation of a hypothetical person. We need to look deeply into our own hearts and consider, what have we done with what God has revealed and what truth we have found. The Bible, which Christians believe to be the Word of God, the Bible which many would argue and could argue, and maybe in another venue, Pastor, we can present this evidence. The Bible, which we believe compelling lines of evidence underscore the truth, the veracity, the trustworthiness of Scripture. The Bible says on the warning side that we really have no excuse. We have been shown. But in a loving, almost pleading sense, the Bible says that whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And I guess as the organizer and initiator of this, I would be remiss to my own conscience if I didn't say, for those that are searching and those that are wondering, search, find, don't bail out on the journey. And we believe if you follow the evidence wherever it leads, you will wind up at Calvary. I want to turn it back over to Pastor Mark Cowart, and again, thanking him and his great staff for their hospitality tonight. As he comes, one final appreciation, and we'll be dismissed. Pastor Mark Cowart.
Well, let's all stand up on our feet tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming out. And as you leave tonight, there's a few things. First, I want to thank everybody that tuned in by internet. And if those of you are watching in Europe, I admire you. It's the middle of the night over there when this thing started, so thank you. One thing we would love to hear from you, your comments. Any of you, just go to our mail on the internet. It would be a blessing to hear your comments. Also, CDs are available tonight in the foyer for purchase. DVDs, you can pre-order those. And there are some books out there that may spark your interest, so we want to encourage you to take the time to look there. Thank you so much for coming out, and we hope we can do this again. God bless you.